Hello friends, for today's video I want to do a tier ranking of 25 plus different fantasy books that Book of the Month has had as part of their selection. Many of us have noticed over the years that books that end up being selections from Book of the Month oftentimes either are part of the Goodreads Choice Award nominees and or they are launched into pretty extreme levels of success. Very few of the books that come out are completely unknown and nobody ends up talking about them. And it does result in this chicken or egg situation where you wonder, do they just have a really good eye for what's going to become popular and also what's going to not just be popular, but for the most part well liked? Or is it that they, as a result of having these books as part of their selections, they are kind of the ones creating this almost false sense of success and popularity, or false sense of quality, you could say. I think it's fair for the assessment to be that it's a combination of both. I wanted to go through and kind of ask myself, on average, do I end up really liking the fantasy books that Book of the Month puts out? Or do they miss the mark more often than not? I will have 6 different categories. The bottom 3, the very quick way to summarize it, is that the books that end up here, by no means am I saying that this correlates with star ratings or anything like that. Rather, these are books that didn't work for me personally, and if they're below this line, this middle line, then they are books that I'm probably not going to keep. Whereas the books that are in tiers 1, 2, and 3 are books that I enjoyed well enough to keep. Even if I enjoy them well enough to keep, the hope is that more often than not, books end up in the top 2 tiers, because tier 3, while it is I enjoyed these and I don't mind them as part of my home library, they aren't the biggest standouts in the world for me, and I would rather not have a fairly average experience with a lot of the books I'm getting from a book box. I would rather, because part of their whole thing is that they curate and they really look for those standout novels. That's what I'm hoping the majority of the books are. I definitely am hoping the majority of the books are not in the lower tiers. Now, of course, as we go through this list, we are going to have differences of opinion. Some of the things that I'm going to put as higher, you would put lower. So I welcome you to not only do a version of this same thing, but you're also going to have read some of the fantasy releases they've had that I haven't picked up. And so I'm very curious if you do end up having a version of this, if you find that the outcome is, hey, actually, they do tend to have some pretty good books on there, or if your outcome is, I don't like the majority of what they release. All that said, let's jump straight into it. I'm actually going to start with tier 3, and there were a decent amount of books that ended up in this tier. If you don't know, with tier rankings, I like to start in the middle and then branch out to the outskirts because I like ending on the extremes. So we're going to start with the more lukewarm-ish feelings. I have quite a few in this list, and I'm just going to go through them pretty quick, which would be Hemlock and Silver, Immortal Longings, Ariadne, All the Stars and Teeth, This Kingdom Will Not Kill Me, and Alchemy of Secrets. I won't be going too in-depth with any of these, though I will have correlating reviews or discussions for any of these in case you're interested in more in-depth thoughts. But with Hemlock and Silver, I'm a huge fan of T. Kingfisher. I really like a lot of her works. I really like that she pushes against these kind of made up lines for where genres are meant to end. And because she has experience writing a lot of different genres, I think she actually utilizes them all really well and can combine them really well. Hemlock and Silver, unfortunately for me, was just not one of my favorites. I thought it was a little repetitive at times, and I think if it had been tightened up a little bit, I would have probably enjoyed it as much as I've enjoyed some of her other works. This one wasn't a favorite. I also, though, I feel like I don't know. It's not that I want to give them some grace, but I think more often than not, if they're going for a T. Kingfisher book as one of their selections, it's a pretty safe bet. This one just wasn't as high up for me, but still in this third tier, I still had fun with it. Just not my favorite T. Kingfisher. Immortal Longings, I do feel like I'm one of the only people that kind of liked this book. And I don't know if this is a situation where the marketing kind of presented it in a way where it ended up being very different, or the reputation of the author and what they have to offer is different in this and what people were expecting. I don't know. I try not to look at other people's thoughts too much. And as such, I was kind of surprised after I read it to discover a lot of people weren't the biggest fan of this, but I thought it was kind of fun. I thought it was kind of cool. It was not reinventing the wheel. It wasn't having the absolute most interesting plot, premise, or characters, but I still had a decent enough time with it. I do plan to eventually read the sequel. It was a little angsty and edgy, but in a way that I thought was a fun enough time. After that, Ariadne. This one, I actually could see it maybe slipping into tier 4. It is, while I'm not going through each individual tier and having things ranked within the tiers themselves, if I were to do that, this one would probably be at the end of this tier because it's okay. It's a retelling. Definitely felt as though the author had a firm grasp on what they were writing within, but I also, as a result, I just didn't really like any of the characters or the plot necessarily, but I liked the writing well enough within this, which is why I have it in this tier. All the Stars and Teeth, it's been years since I read this book and also its sequel, but I remember just having a really fun time with it. It was kind of an action-adventure seafaring story, and the thing that really stood out to me were the descriptions, which has turned out to be true for this author's other works as well, like Belladonna, for example. I think they shine when it comes to how they breathe life into their worlds and their settings. And as such, I think that's why those things stick out to me in my mind more than the plots and the characters. And that's a feat in and of itself, though it doesn't necessarily end up translating to, this is one of my all-time favorites. It doesn't tend to leave its mark as much. This Kingdom Will Not Kill Me is a newer release from this year, and I thought it was a fun take on the concept of a portal fantasy. I do find the character to be pretty rootable, but I wouldn't say I am absolutely in love with it, though I am curious about what's going to transpire in the sequels, because I could see myself growing to like this series more and more with each installment. And the first one does feel like a first book. You're kind of getting introduced to everything. You don't know what's going on, which is common in portal fantasy. You don't know why the character's there, what are the rules and limitations. Kind of have that mystery unanswered, which I am curious by, but I didn't love necessarily the book or any specifics about it. Then we have Alchemy of Secrets. I haven't yet had a chance to talk about this one. This is one of those books where the authorial voice is very clear. It is no secret this was written by Stephanie Garber. Even if you hadn't told me and I didn't know and I read that book, I'd be like, this feels like Stephanie Garber. So I think her voice really shines in it. As a result, it does feel a little similar to her previous works that I've picked up, though I think the setting is a little bit different, but it does kind of have her signature flair for the dramatics with the environments and how everything is described, and it kind of has that nonsensical feel. I enjoyed it, but to be on repeat here wasn't a favorite, which is kind of obvious given that all these are in tier 3. I only had one thing in tier 4, and interestingly, there is a part of me that's like, I could be convinced to reread this and then continue on with the series. And I know a lot of people really like this series. So also, if you want to peer pressure me and tell me, no, you should keep going, then I'll consider it. But that would be Ninth House by Leigh Bardugo. Somewhat interestingly, what I was describing about Immortal Longings being a little bit dark and edgy, but I had fun with it, I feel like Ninth House was dark and edgy, but I didn't have fun with it. And I think it's not really meant to be fun is the thing. There are some pretty serious things that transpire within this, but oddly, I almost feel like the edginess for me kind of actually took away from some of the more serious moments, almost as though at times the kind of cool factor of the main character sort of trumped some of the more poignant moments in a sense, though I'm not saying that's an objective truth about this book. It was just kind of one of the things I felt while reading this. And so as a result, some of the more serious things that I appreciated being present in the novel fell a little bit flat ultimately for me. But as noted, I could be convinced to keep going. Let me know if I should. I am open to it, especially since I think that the conclusion is coming out this year, so maybe I'll give it another go. Branching now into tiers 2 and 5. I'm gonna start with 5. And this is, I know, where a lot of you are gonna think, wait a second, did you mean that was tier 2? And I'm gonna be like, no, this is my tier 5. Because I know a lot of these people are like, what? I really like these. In other tier rankings, these have fluctuated just slightly in tiers depending on what they're pitted against. But today they have landed in tier 5, and I'm just gonna rip the band-aid off and say the first one is Piranesi. We've had conversations. I respect Piranesi. I definitely think it's an experience, and it's unlike anything I've read, and I also am appreciative of the artistry behind it, because I think in a world where a lot of books feel pretty similar, this one feels like nothing, which is exceptional and quite a feat. But I didn't like it, and that's why it's here. However, if I was to rate it based off of my respect for it, I would rate it much higher, but I'm rating it off of how much I liked it, and that's why it's in this spot. And then also Starling House and The Unmaking of June Farrow. I ended up really liking The Everlasting, so I like this author's writing for specifically for Starling House. Starling House just, it actually had semi-similar themes actually to The Everlasting. There is kind of this through line of how stories are retold and reshaped and how our perception of them impacts present day and how we can kind of use stories to our advantage. I just think it was mastered in The Everlasting, whereas here didn't quite hit as strong as maybe I would have liked, or maybe it wasn't as at the forefront as it ended up being in The Everlasting, which it is so at the forefront in that novel. And then June Farrow, I don't have anything necessarily against this book. I wasn't ever like, oh geez, every time I went to pick it up, I wasn't dragging my feet when I picked it up, but it was one of those books that when I finished it, I just didn't really have a lot of feelings about it. The Lost Story, this is another one within this tier. This one, I kind of similar to what I was saying about Piranesi. There's a lot I respect about this book. I think that the themes were very important, very powerful themes, and I think that by having this kind of wholesome quality to it as well, it made it so that it didn't feel as though it was just trying to be shocking or... And I also should say the reverse. It didn't feel like it was romanticizing any of the themes that were present. I just felt like the balance between the cute factor and the wholesome factor versus the more serious subject matter, that balance just personally wasn't to my taste. I have very similar feelings about camp in stories, where if you have a campy story and you nail the balance, it is going to be one of my favorites, because there's just something about having these really important themes, but also all these other factors that are like entertaining and over the top and dramatic and silly and flamboyant. And when you can match all that, it just hits all the boxes. But then when it's kind of uneven, it just ends up not working for me at all. And this one, as noted, I would say the balance between cutesy and serious just didn't quite land. And then the last one in this tier would be The Inheritance of Orquidea Divina. I struggle with multi-generational stories. They tend to not quite work for me only because I am a very character-focused reader. Not every book has to be the most character-focused for me to like it, but the thing with multi-generational is oftentimes you don't have that much time with the characters from different generations, and as such, I sometimes feel a little bit too much distance. And there are books where they have accomplished it in a way that I find really moving. When it can land, where I do care about everybody from every generation, then it is so gut-wrenching. But in this one, again, personally, the balance just wasn't quite what I wanted it to be when it came to showing the impacts versus the characters themselves and how those things from the past have impacted the present. And that is kind of what landed it in this fifth tier. In tier 2, I only have 2 books. We have Dragon Fruit and Last Tale of the Flower Bride. Last Tale of the Flower Bride, I could see not working for a lot of people. It is interestingly using the bones of fairy tales to tell a kind of dark and almost sinister story, but also then sort of provide commentary on fairy tales and how we choose to tell traumatic things and how that kind of informs what we think. And I really found it interesting. I hadn't read anything exactly quite like it. I thought it was very different. But I could also see it not really working for a lot of people. I was just talking about how I'm a very character-driven reader, but sometimes there are exceptions. I think this is one of those books that is a little bit of an exception, because I wouldn't say I cared about the characters really much at all. I just appreciated how the themes were executed within this. And then Dragon Fruit, I think Dragon Fruit's a little underhyped, I will say. Dragon Fruit just has this feeling of being told this tale, and I really, really enjoyed it. It's a standalone, and I thought that the world building was really interesting. The inspirations are ones that I wish we had more of in our fantasy stories. Alas, we do not. And I really liked this, and I definitely am interested to see what else this author writes. Now for, though, tier 6 and tier 1. Do I start with the negative? I think we'll start with the negative, and then we'll end on a positive. Wicked Saints. I said earlier with June Farrow that I finished the book, and I just kind of was left with not a lot of emotions. Wicked Saints, I felt like I finished the book, and I was like, I kind of was into it at the beginning, and then I just kind of got more and more frustrated with things, how they played out. And then at some point, I just purged it from my mind, which speaks to it not quite being something I even wanted to remember, because there are some books that I know for many of us, there's certain books that they're unforgettable, and we can remember specific scenes really vividly and certain character moments really vividly, and sometimes even the settings stand out to us. But then as time passes, you kind of have to like remind yourself of those things, or you relive those things. And then there are books where it's like, I don't wanna, and you're like, no. And I think I kind of felt that way about Wicked Saints. Unfortunately, I mean, it started out in a way that I was like, this is interesting. By the end, I was like, it was interesting. And then we have When the Moon Hatched. I pretty quickly within this one thought, this main character is annoying. And then that thought persisted until the end of the book. There's much more to say about this one, but I'm keeping it brief. I just found the main character to be pretty insufferable. And last for this tier, we have Book of Night. This, I kind of mentioned something similar when I was talking about Hemlock and Silver. I can understand why they were like, oh, it's Holly Black. And many book boxes did at the time. There were, I think Fairyloot, and at the very least, Book of the Month and Illumicrate were having editions of this. And I think there might have been a Fairyloot also. But alas, Book of Night didn't quite deliver on what I was expecting from it. I thought that the general premise was interesting, and I actually could see this being a little higher, because I wasn't mad about the book. I didn't hate the characters or anything like that. I feel kind of similar to it as I do to Ninth House, where I feel like the edgy factor just didn't quite hit the way I wanted. And I maybe there's something to also certain authors who previously wrote in YA, and then now they're having these adult fantasy books, and they're trying to make it clear they're writing an adult fantasy, and it almost feels forced. Maybe that's part of it or something. But I think Book of Night just didn't quite land. I am, side note, eventually going to read the sequel, because I am slowly making my way through the Goodreads nominees from last year. And the sequel was one of them, because of course it was, even though I don't think that was a reader nomination. But I digress. Top tier, the ones that I think were great. I'm going to go through these pretty quick. And obviously, because they're in the top, I really liked them. But also, because I really liked them, chances are I've talked about them pretty extensively in a lot of other videos. So, going through them. City of Brass. I should know, even though I just said, I'm going to go through this pretty quick. I think the David Bott trilogy as a whole holds a special place in my heart. That first book is, in my opinion, not the strongest of the trilogy, but, it set the stage for what ended up being one of my favorite trilogies, and I do like that first book. I just think that the series gets better and better as it goes. So we have City of Brass, The Everlasting, talked about that one a little bit earlier. I'll just go ahead and say that I have 3 V.E. Schwab books on this list. I like V.E. Schwab's writing. I have Bury Our Bones in the Midnight Soil, Fragile Threads of Power, and Addie LaRue. I liked all of those quite a bit. We also have Fireborn. Fun fact, I discovered Fireborn through Book of the Month. Some of these I got because they were on Book of the Month as a selection, and I was interested in them. I was like, oh, okay, well, I'll get this one. And or I was like, it's fantasy, and I like fantasy. Fireborn, I got, and it was one of those like, oh, I'll pick this one up when I pick it up. And then when I picked it up, I was like, oh my gosh, I really liked this a lot. And then the rest is history. I love that trilogy. I think it's great. So thanks, I guess, Book of the Month for putting Fireborn on the map for me. A Sorceress Comes to Call, T. Kingfisher, Divine Rivals and Ruthless Vows, and Kaikeyi. Looking at our results then, we have 10 different books that were in tier 1. We have only 2 in tier 2. I would have preferred a few more here. We have 6 in tier 3. And then for the bottom 3 tiers, we had 1 in tier 4. We had 5 in tier 5. And then we had 3 in tier 6. So overall, majority were in the upper half. I would have preferred if a few more were in tier 2, and it would be great if there were a couple more in tier 1 also. But I think I can definitively say for myself that it's a decent chance that I will, at the very least, enjoy the fantasy books that Book of the Month puts out. I am very curious. I posed this question at the beginning. If you do something similar for yourself, do you find that a lot of the books end up being ones you like? Or you're like, I don't really like any of these. And even if you don't do this for yourself and you just kind of, as you're listening through and you think about the ones that I mentioned that you've read, how often do they end up being ones that you're like, I at the very least kind of liked that? I'm very curious to know. But anyway, that's it. As I said at the beginning, if I have any reviews or discussions for any of these books, I'll have those linked. Thanks so much for watching though. I hope you have a great rest of your day and I'll see you later. Bye.